This is the Rainbow Serpent. It's how a small language model sees the data distribution. Each dot here is a token in a particular context. The transformer sees the context and predicts the token. Roughly speaking, two tokens are going to appear next to each other in this visualization if their susceptibility vectors are similar. I'll say a bit more about what susceptibility vectors are later on. So here's some examples. Here are space tokens. Over here are some numbers. And just ordinary words. So for example, up here we'll find a bunch of the tokens. The Rainbow Serpent is a rainbow because different tokens are colored by their pattern. So you can see the list of patterns here, word part induction, formatting, and so on. So we just look at the spacing tokens. That includes new lines, which you'll see are in a different part of the anatomy to spaces, which are down here. So if I just show the spaces, you can see that new lines occupy a different part of the body of the serpent. Induction patterns. These are quite familiar to those who study language models. These are patterns that are repeated. So you don't always see it because the context is truncated. But for example, here you can see that this J follows this bracket, and it does so for the second time in this context. Or perhaps there are even more occurrences of this bigram in context. So the organization of the body of the Rainbow Serpent by color is an indication that tokens that follow these patterns tend to have similar susceptibility vectors. That's perhaps not that surprising given that many of these actually are the same token, such as these are all spaces. But keep in mind the transformer doesn't actually take this token as input, it's trying to predict that token. And moreover, many of the structures that you can see here actually consist of distinct tokens. So over here we can see space, capital letter, and words, not all of which are the same, right? Since, therefore, there, the. So briefly, what are susceptibilities? Susceptibility is defined given two inputs, an attention head and a token in context. We consider perturbations of the weights in that head and how changes in the overall loss with respect to those perturbations co-vary with the loss on that token in that context. The covariance over perturbations of the weights according to the posterior distribution for that particular head defines the susceptibility. For each token in context, we have a susceptibility vector because we have, well, in this case, 16 heads. So to each token in context, we can associate a 16-dimensional vector, and then we use UMAP to project that down into the number of dimensions that you see here. Two tokens will end up nearby in this visualization if they have a similar pattern of susceptibilities across heads. And we claim what this means is that the network computes the prediction of this particular token on this context in a similar way, if that pattern of susceptibilities is similar. So this is a 3 million parameter model. It's pretty, but it's not that interesting. So let's take a look at some larger models. So you can see here there's time steps for this model over training. We studied those in a recent paper. But I'm going to talk now about Pythia models, starting with the 14 million parameter model. Alright, so this is Pythia 14 million. You can see it's similar in some respects, but different in others. The Pythia tokenizer doesn't have a lot of individual spaces, so most of these spacing tokens are in fact new lines. And you can see that there's some interesting dangly bits, or streaks as we call them, hanging off this side of the, this is the anterior end of the UMAP by our terminology. This is Pythia 31 million. You can see, again, there's some interesting things going on here. And Pythia 70 million. Alright, so what are these dangly bits? One of the most obvious ones is this large streak of induction patterns over here. So let's take a closer look. We can see that these are all variable names in DM mathematics. That's DeepMind mathematics. That's a data set consisting of many different kinds of fairly elementary mathematics questions. So this is all single tokens. They're induction tokens because, for example, this variable has appeared previously in the context. So we might be curious. Let's take a look at all the C tokens in DM mathematics. This is the occurrences that were in that streak that we were looking at. We see another streak over here. These are actually enumerations, right? A, B, C, and so on. So the same token, but a different semantic. So let's take a brief look at the earlier models to see if we can find a similar streak. So I've got 14 million, 31 million, and 70 million set up here. So I'm going to restrict to DM mathematics. And let's see if we can, so there's very visibly the orange streak that we're interested in. If we look for the 14 million parameter model, we can see a bunch of orange tokens in a similar kind of position in the anatomy. But when we click around in here, we'll see divided. Okay, there's a variable, but they're a bit more diffuse. Right, so they're certainly in there, in the same kind of region, but they don't look like this. They're not as separated from the body either. One has to be a bit careful with UMaps and not read too much into necessarily the separation of these little strands, especially if they have a small number of points. So keep that in mind. But nonetheless, we can see that also in the 31 million parameter model. Let's just see if we can find some of these tokens. No, not you. Oh yeah, I haven't got strict mode on, that's why. Okay, so there's one. So that's all the way over there. I wonder if there's any X's. Okay, so this is an X. Alright, so it doesn't really appear that they're forming some sort of cohesive thing like we can see in the 70 million parameter model. When we see coherent streaks like this, what that means is that, modulo the intricacies of UMAP, that these tokens, there's some kind of coherent variation in the susceptibilities of the heads, which is pushing these tokens together and pushing them to the boundary of the UMAP, or even apparently outside of it. And this coherent variation is what we are looking for in terms of structure in these models using susceptibilities. So our hypothesis is then that probably, this is some kind of structure in the model that is responsible for producing these kinds of predictions. And potentially it's not actually formed in the smaller models. But making that case, validating that hypothesis, is the subject of ongoing work. Okay, so here's another entertaining detail. So all data sets formatting, and I'll do the same with the other. So we'll switch these all over to formatting. All right, so there are formatting tokens, for example, full stops, apostrophes, colons, etc. Double stars and exponents. Okay, so let's look at the smaller model. So this is 14 million, and I'm going to look first at full stops and then switch it over to commas. And you'll see that they are distinguishable, but they're in a very similar part of the UMAP body. Whereas if I go up to the 31 million parameter model, you can see that the full stops are starting to migrate towards the other end of the UMAP, and this migration is more pronounced in the 70 million parameter model. Okay, so thanks for watching this episode of Serpentology, and you can learn more about the background for this in our paper.